Now, this is contrary to reason, it's contrary to elementary physics, but that is what the computer programs that run these models are told to assume. See, the computer models can't tell us the answer to our question about what is the effect of CO2 on temperature, how much warming will we get. They are told that information at the outset. So they're programmed to know the answer, and actually it's the wrong answer, to the question we're trying to ask them. So they are valueless for this purpose. But they are useful in that that demonstrates very clearly what the official view is. The official view is extra warming of the planet at the surface, less outgoing radiation escapes into space. This is balmy. Now, what actually happens...
Okay.
And I'll just come on to this because it finishes the main scientific point I want to make here. Then what happens is we put a satellite up called the Earth Radiation Budget Experiment Satellite. This went up, around 20 years ago now. And it simply has a cavitometer pointing at the Earth and measuring how much radiation is coming off the Earth's surface. Now, in fact, it measures radiation coming off from a particular altitude above the Earth called the characteristic emission level. For technical reasons, that's where the radiation appears to be emanating from. But the point is that a detailed study just published by Professor Richard Lindzen, who is the Alfred P. Sloan Professor of Meteorology and Atmospheric Sciences in the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. This is the guy who knows more about the atmosphere than anyone else in the world. He's been studying it for 40 years. He has done a paper where he has simply correlated the changes in surface temperature with changes in the outgoing long-wave radiation, or outgoing radiation of all kinds, in fact. And what he's found is that as the Earth warms, more radiation gets out into space, exactly as you said when you eventually answered the question in a way which you thought was correct rather than congenial. So, and this is quite right. So what we now know is that more radiation gets out to space as it warms, and if the radiation gets out to space, what is it not doing? It's not staying down here causing global warming. It's really as simple as this. And what Dick Lindzen and his postgraduate research colleague Youngsang Choi have done is they've analysed in detail, year by year, for about 15 years, the change in temperature for that year and the change in outgoing radiation for that year, and they've plotted it on what's called a scatter plot, one for each year. Then they've taken the trend of that, and it shows very clearly that there's 6 times as much radiation escaping into space as a result of any given warming down here than the UN's models predict. 6 times as much as they predict. And that means that the effect of CO2 or any greenhouse gas on temperature is, get this, 1/6 of the UN's central estimate. Central estimate, remember, is 3¼ degrees Celsius for a doubling of CO2. The directly measured result is that it's actually only 1/6 of that, which gives you around 0.5, 0.6 Celsius for a doubling of CO2. And that, in any rational world, will be the end of the scare.
If this is the emerging view, if, as you say, there are hundreds and hundreds of scientists who support it,
yes,
why do we hear so often that this huge number of scientists signed a declaration saying there is a crisis? Why would people not be telling the truth? Is there malice involved, money involved, agenda involved?
The simple answer is money, power and glory. Let's take Al Gore. Al Gore was a failed presidential candidate. He'd not been a particularly distinguished vice president. He was hated by more or less everybody he came into contact with because he's an arrogant little so-and-so. He's not a nice man. And he was really at the end of his career until he reinvented himself. And from being worth around $2 million when he came out of the Senate, he is now worth $200 million. And that's not just through charging $300,000 a time, which I know the Singapore government is going to pay him next May to go and speak there, because I'm going too, but they're not paying me anything. They want to make a point by having me going free while he goes for $300,000, and they're going to announce it. I don't think he'll like that very much. But the point is, he's making a lot of money, not only out of speaking, but also he's set up a thing called Generation Investment Management. It's London-based. You couldn't do it in Canada because you're very well regulated financially here. It's not an accident that you don't have a banking collapse as we have. And there's no way he could have set this up in Canada. The rules wouldn't have allowed it. He got away with it in London. He's just taken, for instance, the church commissioners of the Church of England England for $200 million in so-called investment, in so-called green, so-called technologies. And, of course, every so-called green technology is going to hell in a handcart. It's not actually paying its way. These are the worst kinds of investments for financial return that you can possibly make. So he has a very, very large, very, very direct financial interest in making absolutely sure that everybody ends up believing this global warming scare, because only then will governments subsidize the green technologies to the point where they pay, because they don't pay their own way. They have to be subsidized in order to pay, like windmills, for instance, or solar panels. And so he is hoping, as are many others, right across the fossil fuel industries, right across the carbon trading industry, which will soon be bigger than all the world's stock exchanges, provided governments get behind it at Copenhagen and push it, then all of these people who have invented this scare will become prodigiously rich. And they will also be the darlings of the talk show hosts and the darlings of the media, largely dominated by the faction which they identify themselves with. So, of course, you can see very strong incentives, not only for the politicians, but also for the scientists who mingle with politicians, the politicized scientists, to go along with this. And you don't need very many bad pennies to turn the apple cart sour, if that isn't too many mixing of metaphors. And so what is happening is you've got, as best I can make it out, perhaps 24 genuinely bad scientists who are knowingly distorting data. It wouldn't be fair to them to name them, because they can't answer back as Al Gore can. But there's clear evidence and compelling evidence, which I give in my slideshows and presentations on this, of deliberate tampering with the data. For instance, to exaggerate the extent to which the world has warmed in the last 100 years. To abolish the medieval warm period, when the overwhelming results in the literature show that it was real, warmer and global, warmer than the present and global. So for all these dishonesties that are going on, there are people profiting by these dishonesties, and people who are now abjectly terrified because Professor Lindson's paper has come out. It confirms a string of results all the way from the oceans, which have failed to warm in the last 60 years, even though 80 or 90% of the warming caused by anthropogenic increases in greenhouse gas must end up in the oceans, and it's not happening. You go up to the clouds, which are, the more clouds you get, the more the sunlight gets reflected straight back into space. That causes a cooling, whereas the UN imagines it will cause warming. And in the tropical upper air, about 6 miles up, where the models are all told to expect that there will be warming at 3 times the surface rate, that isn't happening either. Each of these different results, from the oceans via the clouds to the upper troposphere, and then, of course, out to the Irby satellite in space, all give you climate sensitivities of around 0.5 Celsius of warming for a doubling of CO2. In other words, we now know from all these different observations, which all agree with one another, they're being done by separate scientists, by separate methods, we now know that climate sensitivity is low, the debate is over, and in a direction which most of the people watching this programme would probably not have expected.
More to come. Back in a few moments on The Michael Coren Show. We'll see you.